This is the Calimesa Insider Podcast, the original Pass Area City podcast, focusing on the ins and outs of your city government at work. And now here's the host of Calimesa Insider, City Manager Will Kolbow.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Calimesa Insider. I'm glad to have you with us this week. We hope you enjoyed last week's episode with special guest Chris Gray. I do want to apologize for the microphone. He does not sound like that. And so there was some trouble with I think the headset he was wearing. So we apologize for that, but I hope you got the gist of the interview. And I think that we covered a number of topics. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I really encourage you to do so. Before we get into anything else, I just wanted to say real quick, because we do have an event coming up tomorrow. And so it's very, very timely. So I don't know if you're going to listen to this beforehand, but the West Riverside Council of Governments, WRCOG, will be hosting a used oil recycling event at the Calimesa AutoZone located on 1095 Mount Calimesa Boulevard. It's again tomorrow from 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. So actually, Chris used this as an example of some of the services that WRCOG provides to its member agencies. So we hope you'll be able to check that out. I'm also working on a County Line Road timeline episode. I just wanted to dive into the timeline and look at what's actually happened to get where we are, since the subject is ripe with speculation and especially misinformation. And there's all these things. It's like, oh, it must be corrupt because it's taking longer. Not because there's, 10 different projects related to this thing with various agencies that the communication hasn't always been the best. Let's just put it that way. And there's been tons of delays related to external organizations, the state among them. So there's probably a need to talk about exactly what that was. So when and we want you to be our ambassadors. If you're a loyal listener to the podcast and you hear somebody talking about County Line Road or you see it online, this will be the episode that you'll share with them. Not this one today, obviously, but the one that we will share when we share that timeline and go into detail on that. And then we'll try to break it down as best we can for bite-sized chunks on our social media platforms. So that's the plan for that. To say that I had a busy week would be an understatement. Now, part of that's because it was a 3-day week and you're trying to cram 4 days worth of work into 3 days. It can get pretty daunting. We had a city council meeting on Tuesday, and we talked about that. We had the preview of that. The council did get into the TUMF program quite a bit and asked a lot of good questions. So it was a really good conversation, and it really got into the crux of not only the TUMF program, but how it's helped Calimesa. We did talk about that a lot with Chris Gray last week, but I think this really drills down into actually how it impacts our city in particular. So if you haven't watched the council meeting from this past Tuesday, I encourage you to do so. On Wednesday, Mayor Molina, Mayor Pro Tem Cervantes, and I met with Congressman Ken Calvert, and his team, his staff, to talk about various projects in the city. We did talk a lot about what is happening in Washington with the fiscal year 25 budget and the March 14th expiration of the continuing resolution that basically held all of appropriations at the fiscal year 24 levels, but it also had policies embedded in it from the prior administration. So there is going to be some motivation to move on that. That is important for the city of Calimesa because part of that, but the fiscal year 25 budget includes $5 million for the missing ramps at Singleton Road. So obviously there is a big implication for us. Without that $5 million, the project does get much more complicated to try to fund. We do have $8 million from the TUMF program already secured. The $5 million will get us across the finish line. So we're really watching that very, very closely, and we're engaging with Congressman Calvert's office for anything that we can do. Not that we can do a lot as a small city in the federal budget process, but the good news is that Ken Calvert does have a lot of pull because he's the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. He's also the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. So it is an advantage to have a congressman that has those positions and has been in Congress for a long time and has seniority. So this week, I did want to talk about the CalCities City Manager Conference that I went to a couple of weeks ago. I did post a video on Instagram about that, and I also talked a little bit about day 2 and my day. That was probably the busiest day of the conference. And so I'm going to go through some of the sessions that I went to, and I just want to, it gives you an idea of the things that people in my position are dealing with, not just in Calimesa, but all over the state. There were hundreds of city managers there, and other, deputy city managers, department directors, things like that. I was the only one from Calimesa that went. I didn't stay at the venue. I tend to not do that because I know to look at me, you'd think that I'm some big partier and I'm some outgoing socialite or something like that. Obviously, that's not the case. So, unless I have to fly there and it's a long way away, it's prohibitive for me to come home every night. I prefer to come home. So I did make the drive out to Rancho Mirage every day. Not too bad of a drive against traffic, so it's not that bad to get out there. So I didn't stay out there, but so you do miss some things that way because there are other social events, and that's the bonding that you can get, and you build your contacts and other colleagues, and you can call other people in other cities saying, hey, we're dealing with this issue. How have you guys dealt with this? How have you dealt with it? So you do miss out on some of that, but you do get a lot of it when you're still at the conference. So the first session I went to was about onboarding new council members, and that one intrigued me because obviously we just went through that. So I wanted to see what other cities are doing. They had the city manager of the city of Fullerton, as well as both the deputy city manager and city clerk for the city of Livermore up north. And so I was interested to see what other cities are doing, some tips and tricks that we can do. And they talked about what you do before the election, during the election cycle, and then after when you have new council members coming on board. And not only how you treat people that were victorious, but also people that weren't elected, because obviously if you run for office, it shows that you care about your community, right? That it takes a lot to put yourself out there, and it takes a lot of time and commitment to campaign for a position on the council. So, you want to be respectful of not only the people that won, obviously, because they're going to be your boss, but also you want to be respectful of the people that didn't win, because they're still trying to participate in our democracy, and obviously they've taken a great interest in the city. And you never know, maybe in 2 years, they'll run again and they'll win. So you want to make those connections if you can. And there are some things that we did to onboard council members Garcia and Cudniff when they were elected, and have them meet with each of our department heads to talk about the functions of their departments and the major things that they have happening and projects and things like that. And there are some things that I learned that we could probably do differently or additionally next time when we go through that. So that was an interesting session. So that was the only session from, it started in the afternoon. So I came to City Hall in the morning and then went to the conference in the afternoon. So the next day was the full day. And so right away, first discussion was called Wildlife Crisis Discussion. It was led by former Malibu City Manager Reva Feldman, who was the city manager in Malibu when the Woolsey fire hit back in 2017. So it was lots of good discussion. And the timing was because of the fires. I mean, this wasn't originally a planned session. They kind of threw it together last minute based on what was happening in LA and Altadena. So lots of good discussion, lots of good tips. We talked about a lot about municipal water systems. And that's something that we need to talk about. I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but we need to set what realistic expectations are of the water systems. Now, there's some cities that have actually built parallel water systems to fight big fires. City of San Francisco, for example, has a secondary water system. Its pure purpose is to fight major fires. Not your run-of-the-mill structure fire that's isolated to a single building, but like something that was widespread, like the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Remember, that was not the earthquake itself isn't what did the damage. It was the subsequent fires that did the damage. So in response to that, the city actually built a supplemental water system specifically for that purpose. And because it's only used for that purpose, it's not used for drinking water, they can actually bring seawater into that system as well. Now, is that what you want to do everywhere? That'd be difficult to do. It's very, very expensive. And it was done at a different time and place, right? That system was put in over 100 years ago because, it was done shortly after, as they rebuilt the city from the 1906 earthquake, they put these in. And so you have to remember that doing that today, even in a small area like Calimesa, would cost tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, just for our city alone. But there are things that we're doing to address it. And so, the problem that I had as a public administrator is that this issue was used as political fodder, which does no good, because if you don't want to talk about the mechanics and the realities of water, releasing water from federal dams in Central California was not going to solve the issue that was happening in LA, in Altadena. It just wasn't. For one thing, that water doesn't even flow to the California aqueduct, which ultimately serves Southern California. And number two, the city of LA is not a state water contractor. They have their own water sources in the Owens Valley, for example. That's where the city of LA gets a lot of their water. So, again, you have to understand the complex. We have the most complex water system. And you look at statewide and the conveyance of water from north to south, we have the most complex and sophisticated water system in the world. And yes, there is a need for more storage. Yes, there is a need to make sure that water is available, but that would not have changed what happened with the LA fires. There's not a single municipal system that is going to be able to output that much water at one time. You just don't have the pressure. Because if you did, and it's the system that you connect to for regular potable water, your pipes would burst instantly, because the pressure would have to be so high to be able to be opened up to allow for that much flow. You'd have to have the system ready at all times. Well, if your 3/4 inch meter is connected to that, it'll blow your system out. You'll be running 300-400 PSI. There's not pressure reducers enough to be able to to reduce that pressure to serve a municipal a domestic water system. So that's something that I want to talk about in a future episode, again, with the fire chief and our city engineer. Another session I went to had to do with mental health and the city manager position. And so this was real talk about the human aspect of this job. And yes, it's a job. It's a job. It's a very unique one, though, that many people do not understand. And it's so unique that people don't really understand what a city manager does. And when you don't understand what somebody does, usually you discount what they do because you don't understand it. So if I don't understand it, it must not be important, and they must just be a paper pusher and just taking up time and space and money. We internalize as city managers. Most city managers care deeply about the cities that they serve, whether they live there or not. And we internalize a lot of what happens. And there's just this image that people have of people in my position and people that work for government, that we're just a bunch of unemotional, corrupt robots. And we're seeing that happening at the federal level right now. Now, I think that there is need for reform at the federal level. I absolutely agree with that 100%, because we get frustrated with the federal government. We get frustrated with the state government. I've talked about that many, many times on this podcast, but they're still human beings. And the vast majority of them are not corrupt people. As a matter of fact, again, I don't have any numbers to back this up necessarily, but I think I've heard studies that show that when you look at fraud, actual, like real fraud is not abuse and fraud is not because you don't agree with something. Okay. If you don't agree with policy and the way money's being spent, and they actually just go and spend it that way, that's not fraud and abuse. So we need to understand what those terms mean and the seriousness of those terms. But when you talk about actual fraud, when people steal money, I talked about that lady in Illinois that sold $40 million from that city. And quite frankly, I told you that the punishment wasn't enough. That should be LWOP, life without parole, because that to me is disgusting. And when that happens, it pisses me off more so than it happening in a private enterprise. And so it actually does happen less in the government level than I think in the private sector. People won't believe that, but we think about the community impacts of everything we do, every single day. And we only hear from people when there's a problem, right? So we're lucky to have, I'm very blessed and fortunate to have a city council that recognizes our work as staff and does does recognize that we generally care about the city that we serve, and sometimes to the detriment of our mental and physical health. I mean, that's how serious it is as a city manager. And I lose sleep over things that are happening in the city and things that I worry about, and making sure that we're doing, am I serving enough? Am I doing enough for the city? I think about it all the time. And I don't know if people really realize that. And so there's a big mental toll on that. And then when all you get is people that think you're corrupt and don't care, and you're unethical, and all these different things, that makes it even more disheartening, because the job itself is hard enough. And then when you have people making accusations because they don't understand, they don't get it, is really where it hits hard for me, and it's really taxing mentally. So anyway, enough about that. There's been a sales tax working group at CalCities that's been working since 2022 on updating our tax codes for sales tax. It consists of 32 city council members throughout the state, 8 city managers, and 7 members from other organizations, the state, CalCities, and whatnot. And the proposal that they're working on is to overhaul the sales tax distribution for fulfillment centers. And this will be a topic. I'll go into more depth of what that means in a separate episode on sales tax, because I did talk about property tax before. I think a conversation also needs to happen about sales tax. And that session provided a really good foundation and a lot of good information that I'm going to be able to share with you in that episode. But in a nutshell, there's a recognition that e-commerce has impacts to cities that have fulfillment centers, and all the cities that are receiving the deliveries, the actual point of delivery, which is pretty much all of them, right? I mean, there are people that order on Amazon here in Calimesa. Amazon vans are in our city every day. So they're looking at splitting up the sales tax to try to balance that out. So right now, all sales tax goes to where the fulfillment center is located. And this has created a winners and losers scenario. So for example, I use this example a lot. I pick on them a lot. So sorry, Elizabeth over at City of Beaumont, but Beaumont sales tax has increased by over $20 million annually in just a 3-year period after the opening of fulfillment centers in their city. And they don't just have Amazon, they have others as well, but Amazon's obviously probably the primary contributor to that. Now, I don't have those exact numbers. Those numbers are confidential. By state law, they're confidential. So Beaumont actually is legally barred from sharing that information. So we don't know what those exact numbers are, but I mean, I would anticipate, Amazon is by far the biggest e-commerce player in the space. And it was not a coincidence that their sales tax spiked once the Amazon warehouses opened. So again, more on that to come. It's a lot more complicated than you think, just as a lot of these topics are. And then there was an economic forecast update by Chris Thornburg, and I've always found him very fascinating. I talked about him before in October when I shared with my experience at the League of California Cities Conference. And this presentation covered what is happening in our economy, what we think is happening in our economy, I should say. That's our social narrative or lived experience. What is actually happening in our economy, our objective statistical reality, and how those two combine that drive the forecast. That's what drives the forecast. So narratives drive choices while economics determine outcomes. Okay. He says that good choices and smart policy start with the correct narrative. And then that vein, our city is actually currently undergoing an economic analysis and a market study to give us the objective data for what will work best for our community within the realities in which our region operates. So we are situated in the Inland Empire. And what do we have a lot of in the Inland Empire? Warehouses, right? So that's why there's such a demand for them. We're not asking for them. Do you think that we're going out and recruiting? I wonder if people really believe that council members or myself as the city manager are calling companies and saying, you need to build a warehouse here. That phone call has never happened. I don't know if there's any city that's phone calls happened. Maybe City of Industry. I don't know. He provided a variety of graphs and charts, Chris Thornburg did, to show the real data, but he summarized the U.S. outlook like this. The economy will continue to grow. cooling to normal, creating some turbulence. Household finances look great, which means consumer demand will stay strong. But there are some worries that are growing as well. Strong household finances are a function of bubbly asset prices and yawning federal deficits, which has been a big topic of a conversation, right? External imbalances are growing unsustainably. So these are basically trade deficits that are growing unsustainably, and those are funded typically by debt. The new administration, he says, this is him saying this, okay? The Republican sweep is driven by vibe, not mandate. But he says big changes come with consensus, not division. And the bigger issue is going to be what they don't do. So we see a lot happening, a lot of things happening, but the bigger issue is going to be what they don't tackle and what they don't address. So one of the graphs I saw was interesting. The wage gap has been shrinking. So as the bottom 50% of wage distribution grew by 17.2% in real, meaning inflation adjusted dollars, over the past 10 years versus 10.7% for the upper 50%. And the top 50% actually took a greater loss in the post-COVID economy than the lower 50%. So I just thought that was interesting. Now, one contributor to the national debt was our reaction to COVID. And so Chris shared that COVID resulted in economic losses, so losses in GDP, of about $1.2 trillion. But the federal stimulus actually injected $6 trillion into the economy, 5 times the amount of the losses. And so household net worth increased by $30 trillion from 2020 to 2022. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that inflation followed. But since the end of 2023, inflation has actually gotten back into the normal long-term average. And I think that's why that still even feels high or seems high. I think there's isolated pieces in the economy where prices are spiking because of, one-off events like bird flu and things like that. So we're seeing the price of eggs. But also, we got so used to this 1% to 2% inflation that we basically saw post-recession all the way through COVID, that when things kind of spiked back up, number one, as a result of the stimulus, but now we're returning to 3%. People seem to forget that 3% is basically the long-term average. And so that's why it's interesting, because we haven't seen the long-term average in the last 20 years, because things, things heated up artificially in the housing market. Then we had this big recession. And then it followed by a period of sustained low inflation, which was abnormal if you go back and look at the last 40, 50 years. So those are things to keep in mind. So it was a really, like I said, really interesting. It's always interesting to get Chris's perspective on the economy. And then the last session I went to was called Managing in the Age of Grievance. And I've spoken about this subject on the podcast before, about social media and the rise of distrust and people emboldened to air their grievances, whether they're real and justified, and there are plenty that are real and justified, or perceived maybe because of national politics or because of selfishness. Quite frankly, I mean, I'm just being real with you guys. 73% of local officials, this is both elected and I believe it's elected and appointed, like city managers, report experiencing harassment. And of those, 89% experienced harassment on social media, and 84% experienced it during public meetings. And so I will say this, I do have more respect for people that will throw stones at me or the city while looking at me in the eye versus those that do it behind a keyboard. I will tell you that. 23% experienced harassment of their family or loved ones, which is ridiculous. I mean, that number should be 0. I mean, it's one thing if you go for somebody that was elected and ran for council, their families are off limits. Honestly, that's absurd. And I've heard city managers that have had their families and loved ones followed. Their children were being followed. That is, that's absurd. That should not be happening. Almost 60% feel it has gotten worse since they first got in office. So a lot are feeling that it is getting worse. It's actually progressing. So what has also been found is that most people are airing their grievances do not actually want to solve problems. They just want to complain. And it's not even about feeling like they're being heard. People take pleasure in doing this, which is why a lot of the attacks are so vitriolic, and they want to inflict pain on people. And that's why a lot of it takes place online, because quite frankly, they're cowards. I think they want to say these things, and they want to, beat their chest about how I'm, giving it to the man or whatever. It's cowardly to me. That's just my opinion. The turnover rate in the city manager field is about 25%, which means the average tenure ends up being about 4 years. Now, some cities kind of skew that. There's some cities that have had many, many city managers over a short period of time. And then city managers and staff end up being the scapegoats for failed policies without consideration of who is actually making those policies. So whether it's former councils and people there's a clean sweep of the council, they want to blame not just the prior council, but they want to blame the city manager. They want to blame the department directors. They want to scapegoat. And so I will say this is why I'm so thankful to have a city council that not only really cares about the community, but also has the keen understanding that staff is genuinely doing the best that we can for the community and appreciates that work. So as a city manager, I can't tell you how valuable that is. And I've had people, not to toot my own horn or anything, but I've had people tell me that they see me as a very skilled city manager, and they think I can take on a bigger city, and that I should grow into a bigger city. But number one, I love working here. And that's a big reason I love working here, is because I have a very supportive council. I have a very good relationship with the staff. I've made a lot of good relationships and friendships in the community. And so there's a lot of value in that. And yeah, maybe I can go to a bigger city and make more money, but the stability that it brings to work with a community like this, there's not, you can't put a dollar amount on it, but it really does make you think that, hey, there's no reason for me to leave, especially when you see that a lot of city managers don't have that, and it makes an already difficult job that much harder. So if I trade a great situation that I'm in for more money and a crappy situation that I could be out from in 2 years because the council doesn't get it. They don't get what the role of the city manager is. And if I'm just following their orders and that doesn't work and they want to throw me under the bus, what can I do, right? People seem to think also that when they call City Hall or air a grievance about something, that somehow that is all we are dealing with. That's just that single issue, that we need to drop everything and all the staff needs to focus on just this thing, as if we don't have a million other things that we're trying to take care of. We may be a small city, but we're a staff of 36, including a full service fire department, doing a bunch of things for 11,000 residents and hundreds of businesses just to try and keep up with what the community expects, and rightly so, by the way. I think that most people in the community have realistic expectations about what we are. There are a few keyboard warriors that are completely unrealistic and think that we can do all these things and they're paying too much in taxes, so they should pay less in taxes and get more services. So, I have $20,000 and, the car I wanted 2 years ago was $20,000, but it's actually $30,000 now, but I don't want that $30,000 car now. I want the $40,000 car, but I still want to pay 20. That's the attitude some people have, just to give you an analogy. So, it's always an interesting experience going to these conferences and seeing what other cities are dealing with. And, for the league conference in October, it was both inspirational and a bit depressing at the same time. And I think I shared that with you. All these great ideas, getting my creative juices flowing, but just not enough resources to execute them, at least yet. I mean, I feel like we're going to get there. We're just not there yet. This time, based on the sessions that they had, I came away feeling thankful and grateful. I mean, sure, like I mentioned, we do have detractors that simply have no sense of the cards that we have to play, but it pales in comparison with some of the challenges that my colleagues in other cities face. I mean, just look at the cities around us and the things that are happening there. So I am so thankful for this community, for all of you that are listening, a supportive city council, and an excellent staff that works really, really hard for this city. They don't ever get enough credit. but they certainly should. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank all of you for making this place a difficult job is as pleasant as it can be. Let's just put it that way. So with that, I think that's a good note to end on. We're going to wrap up this episode. Our next city council meeting will be Monday, March 3rd. That's my wife's birthday, by the way. So I'll be celebrating my wife's birthday at a council meeting. Sorry, honey. That'll be at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center. Catch it live in person or on the city's YouTube page by going to calimesa.gov/YouTube. Subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok, both at Calimesa Insider, all one word, where you'll find highlights and bonus content. And so until next time, have a great rest of your weekend. I will talk to you again next week. Take care.